To help you understand 32-bit float, I'm going to take the approach in this video of explaining what sound design and TASCAM left out in their technical literature. And it's stuff you should really know and will help you understand. Okay, so here's the SoundDevices 32-bit float files explained. That's my coffee maker going off. And this is one of the first files I had read about this. I'd read about 32-bit float quite a while ago. Anyway, it starts out talking about 16-bit words in computers. And because I make a living working with computers, I mean, this is stuff I already knew. And then it goes into this stuff about putting this noise in dB form. So saying, okay, we're going to take the data and let's talk about levels of dB. Now, fine. I mean, but I recognize that when you talk about dBs, you're talking about a scale. You're not talking about numbers, right? Numbers go like this, okay? Those are the numbers in the scale. So in here, in 16-bit, you can have up to 65,536 numbers, one to that number. But you can scale it any way you want. So you could call the one 0 dB, and you could call the 4 1 dB, right? You can scale it any way you want. And that's fine because they're talking about audio. But what they will do later is they will commingle the two, which you can't do. No computer engineer, no electronics engineer is going to create electronics or data using dBs as their scale. It's going to be the scale of the numbers in that data space. So in 16-bit, 65,536. Anyway, just keep that in mind. Then they explained 24-bit, which is 50% more bits exactly. So with 24-bit, you can get any value of your amplitude from your microphone, let's just say, from 0 to 16,777,215. Now that assumes that your microphone or your analog to digital converter can create that number of values, but we'll leave that aside for now. So, okay, we have 24-bit, and then once again, they put it into dBs, like what it means if you're listening to it, the sound, it's perceived loudness. dBs are used because it's the way we perceive the loudness. But again, it's a psychological perception, has nothing to do with the actual data. Then they talk about 13-bit float, and then things start to get interesting. Compared to fixed point 16 or 32, they store a number, blah, blah, blah. This is fundamentally different than fixed point because numbers in these wave files are stored with scientific notation. Now, that's sort of right, but very wrong. Computers don't see scientific notation, integer notation, dBs, or anything like that. All binary data is like this. We represent it as a box, and each bit contains a 0 or a 1. So this in bits, so there'd be 0 for the 1, 1 for the 2, and there's 4, 8, so it'd be 8. This would equal 10 for us. But the computer only sees this. It doesn't see anything like scientific notation. It doesn't see this at all. This is just how we'd want to represent it. Instead, what they really mean is wave files are stored with numbers represented as two components. 3 components here, but 2 are important. And those 2 components is the exponent, or the mantissa, which is right here. And by the way, this is a 24-bit number, essentially from 1 to 16,777,216, except it's stored in fractions, binary fractions. I'm not going to get into that, but for the sake of argument, just understand this: 24 bits of very precise data, and a second number, the exponent, which is right here, and that's an 8-bit, so it's basically 1 to 256. So floating point is saved using more numbers, and they link more info here, which is right here. So they're talking about this standard. And if you go through the standard, let me just search precision in this. You'll see there's 34 mentions of precision. Why is that? Well, we're going to get to that. Anyway, the bottom line is that floating point numbers are apples and oranges to fixed bit memory, like 16-bit, 8-bit, 16-bit, or 24-bit, because it's actually just two components. And the computer just stores these two numbers, the mantissa and the exponent. And then whenever you ask for the number, it will take the mantissa to that exponent. So if the mantissa is, well, see, they're listing it not in a way that would make sense here. But it would take the mantissa. Let's say the mantissa is 2 and the exponent is 3, right? And there's 2 times 2 is 4, 2 times 4 is 8. But it doesn't list, it's not written as 8 in here. It's written as 2 to the third. And you have to keep that in mind. And you have to keep in mind also that no analog to digital converter outputs the amplitude from your microphone as a pair of numbers, as a mantissa, as an exponent. It will always be in some sort of binary number that is stored in memory. So for the computer to create this, it actually will have to take that number that from your microphone analog to digital converter and convert it into a 32-bit float. But for the computer, that's very easy, and they just make chips that are definitely there for it. So now they do some math again, where they put this into dB format, and that's fine. So they're just basically saying that the numbers in 32-bit float are so wide, they're way wider than any sort of sound that we can acoustically hear. But as we all know, we're going to move it around. So in the end, we're just going to use probably some something from 0 to, I'm just making this up, to like 70 dB. But when we have this range, we can now put it anywhere in there. So that's a benefit of 32-bit float. When you're doing post-processing, it creates a wide range to put it in. So so it says here that the dynamic range, blah, blah, blah. So it's talking about dB. And again, this has nothing to do with the computer data. The computer data is in bits. I don't know how many times I'm going to have to keep saying that multiple times. If you talk to an engineer of electronics and you say, I want a circuit, I want memory of 770 dBF. I want a memory of that contains negative 758 dBFS to plus 770 dBFS, he wouldn't know what you're talking about. And if he did sort of know what you're talking about, he would mention something I'm going to get to very quickly. All right, so the dynamic range, blah, blah, blah. Again, this is all nonsense because it's just about scale. We're not talking about scale. Anyway, there's another aspect of 32-bit float files, which is not immediate obvious. And it's not the thing there is something that they should mention, but they're not. They say files recorded with 32-bit float record sound where 0 dBFS, that's dB's full scale, of the 32-bit files line up with 0 dBFs of a 24 and 16-bit file. Now, they're correct as far as the digital audio interface and the software is concerned. But they're incorrect in that's how it's working within their sound recorders, their sound devices, the actual equipment that they sell. But before we get to that, let me explain this more. In 16-bit, as I mentioned before, this scale, if we blow up this scale, it's 0 to 65,000, whatever, I forget. And in 24-bit, this scale, if we blow it up, is 1, I now have this number memorized, 1 to 16,777,216. So that's that scale. And this scale is like this, right? So this scale is obviously bigger than this scale, than the 16 and 24-bit. And now in the 32-bit scale, they're showing it to be huge. Now, if it was 32-bit fixed, if it was fixed, not floating point, the scale would be around right here. Something like that. If you just look at the how it's growing, actually probably more like this, right? This would be the scale of 32-bit fixed if you were comparing it against 16-bit and 24-bit and 32-bit. So how do you get this scale? Well, how does floating get that? And I'm going to talk about something very important. It's a very scientific term. It's called the free lunch. Free lunch. How does 32-bit floating get the free lunch of all this expanded range? I mean, if you can get expanded range by just adding float to it, why not make it 24-bit float? Why not make this a float and get this range like that, right? Why not make 16-bit float and get the range like this? So, I mean, you don't need to understand anything about math to ask this question. You can just look at this very simple graph. How do you go from this size to this size to this size, right? When this size is way beyond what you'd expect if you just added another 8 bits to the 24-bit. What are you losing? Okay? And this is what sound design leaves out, and TASCAM and all the others. What they're leaving out is, remember, let's talk about 24-bit again. If we expand that 24-bit, as I mentioned, we have a scale of, let's say, 0, again, to 16,777,216. And each of those numbers is 1, 2, 3, 4, right? And these numbers are very precise because the distance between each number here is the same. It's by 1, right? You add 1, you keep going. So when you want to quantize an audio signal, say the signal is like this, right? What you want is you want evenly spaced potential numbers to graph this, right? So you want to have a number here. Say you'd want to have a number here, a number here. I mean, these are the only numbers you could choose, but you know that it's precise if you go to these, if you plot these numbers along the line, and you understand, obviously, that the more numbers you add, the more fine detailed your scale becomes, and the greater ability to represent your audio data with higher fidelity. So that's why you want more bit depth. What sound design is not telling you about 32-bit float is if you expand these numbers here, they are not all evenly spaced. So this number, it might be 1.1137. I'm just making these up, but it's still the general idea. 1.2200, 1.4532. All the spaces between these are these variable numbers. So this would be like 1.36. Let's say this is, I'm just making these up, 1.75. These are all 0.99. The spaces between these numbers have these errors. That's the cost you have to pay for widening your scale using the 32-bit float format, which is always a number. As I said, it's always the mantissa to the exponent. It's always, let's say, 2 to the third. But in this case, in this type of math, it's going to be in practice like 1.3432 to the 11th, okay? So this is what they're leaving out. So it's not comparable. So getting back to the electronics engineer, if you say to them, you say, okay, I want a range of this to this in memory, they will say, well, okay, well, to get this range in memory, you'd need something like, I'm again just making this up, but it's probably something like 16,755 bits of data, some humongous amount. Again, not 16, not 16 bits, but 16,700, whatever. I'm just making this number, but a huge number. They would say, however, if you want to get this range, but you'll allow for some imperfections in between each number, we can do it using a mantissa and exponent way of doing things. And that's how things work in Excel, by the way, in many software, because as humans, we don't really care about the errors on some very large numbers and stuff like that in practice. But here it makes a difference. Now, there's another thing to realize about 32-bit, which sound design is not mentioning, is, okay, well, if they're writing the microphone data into their device into 32-bit float, and it has all these errors you're talking about, like, wouldn't it lead to a lot of distortion? Like, wouldn't it be bad? And since it sounds like okay to me, isn't it fine? So yeah, I mean, yeah, you say that, but my experience, and this is the comments I get all the time on my things, my experience is it works. It works. Now, what's working, why it's working, I'm not going to get into that right now, but I'll just answer that very simple question. What most people don't understand that's going on within SoundDevices, TASCAMs, and all these devices is, remember that we have a let me go back to the single. Now, this is a single point. And I just want to show you here. If I search noise floor in this, there's no mention of noise floor. Well, we'll get to that with TASCAM. Sorry. As I mentioned, there's a fraction and there's the exponent here. And as I had mentioned before, this is completely precise, this 24-bit number. So what happens with in SoundDevices equipment, and again, you can call them and say, hey, Max said this is what happens. Is this really what happens? And let them explain how it happens. I've asked them. They have not explained it to me, and they will not change this document here. Okay. So what happens is, remember I said that these numbers are all essentially some number, a mantissa to an exponent. So if we take a number, let's just say we take our simple example of 2 to the third, which is 2 times 2 times 2, right, which equals 8. So if we take 2 to the third, we get 8. So when they store this number, when they store the 2 and the 3 in their 32-bit space, they get 8. But as I mentioned, in the real world, they might get 8.0001, whatever, a whole bunch of these inaccurate numbers. Again, the scale here is exact. The scale here, if you blew it up, looks like this. It's not, it's random. It moves all over the place. Anyway, so if you take any of these numbers, so even if you take, I'm going to take the 2/3 and you want to get back to it, all you would do is you would take the that number, your components, and you would say 8, right, to the power of 1 over the root will give you 2. Will give you that mantissa, that very accurate number. Again, oops. This number is completely accurate. The fraction, the 24-bit number essentially, is just like 24-bit fixed, completely accurate. By the way, the exponent is completely accurate, but the exponent is only used for scale. It's not used as a number. This doesn't create an extra number. Well, I mean, it does, but it doesn't create an accurate number. I mean, it's essentially you're taking two accurate numbers, and because they're fractions, when you're multiplying them, you're creating these imprecisions. Now, they're very small imprecisions, but they're still imprecisions, as I mentioned, in using when you're actually going to use the data. But you can go back to this. So what happens in a SoundDevices thing is you have your microphone. It creates these amplitudes, which aren't, waves are what we see. It just sees in a point of time these numbers. So it just outputs, let's say, every 1/48 thousandths of a second, it'll put in a number 1, 7, 3, whatever that amplitude is at that time. That's what it's putting out. It doesn't output a exponent and a mantissa. So what SoundDevices, what their equipment will do is they'll say, okay, it's a 7. Well, these are actually, it's a 7. It's going to do a calculation. And again, this just get into the weeds, but essentially it does a calculation. It'll split 7 into a number that's m to the e. So it'll create this m to the e number in the 32-bit float, right, which is 2 components, the mantissa. Now I've screwed up the size. So again, the mantissa is right here, and the exponent is right here. So it'll take this number, any of the numbers from the microphone ADC, and it will put them into the 32-bit float memory space. But when you listen on your speakers, anybody listens, do you listen to mantissas and exponents? No, you have to listen. Your speaker can only take one value of current. It can only send, say, 7 trillion electrons to the speaker coil to generate that sound. It's not going to send 2 numbers. So therefore, what happens, like I said, is they just do the math. They just do the number equals the 1 over the exponent factor, and they get back to that mantissa accurate number, and they send that to the speaker or whatever you're listening to. And this is the stuff that sound design has left out of their explanation. And then they have these sample files which are bogus. It's just, anyway, I'm not going to get any farther into that. Again, the only takeaway I want you to understand is these are accurate. And this is imprecise. And what is fidelity? Fidelity is, the definition of fidelity is accuracy. It's not imprecision. All right. Let's move on to TASCAM. So TASCAM, like SoundDevices, immediately tries to confuse you by showing you pictures of waves. And there is no wave as far as the computer is concerned. All the computer sees is when you sample at these rates, it sees these numbers. So let's just say we're using, this is a 0, and this is a 1, and this could be a 2 if it was at least 3 or 4 bit. So this is a 0, and this is a 1, and this is a 1, and this is a 0. It doesn't see anything else. It doesn't see this wave. So it actually would see the same thing here. This is a 1. Oh, sorry, this is a 0. This is a 1. This is a 0. This is a -1. This is a 0. Right? It only sees in these specific discrete numbers. The wave is what you see. It has nothing to do with what's stored in computer memory, whether it's a fixed or a 32-bit float. Okay, so from a production standpoint, advancing from 16-bit recording to 24-bit recording makes a difference in fidelity, yes. But why 32-bit float recording? What is 32-bit float recording anyway? And will it really make a difference compared to 32-bit recording? Now, if you've been following, the answer is no difference whatsoever when it comes to, and I want to be very clear, when it comes to recording. Anyway, let's look at what 32-bit float recording is, how it works in practice. Yeah, what you think in your head it's doing and what's actually happening in the electronics, and how your audio productions will benefit from that. All right. Goes into some gobbledygook about high gain. The simple way to describe bit depth in terms of audio recording is that it represents the dynamic range you can capture without distorting the audio. Yes, I'll accept that. Okay. This determines how loud of a sound you can record without introducing digital clipping, for sure, but it also determines how much higher your recording sits above the always present noise floor. Now, this is what I want to show you here. So here's the Wikipedia definition of general floating point. I'm going to search noise floor. There are no mentions of noise floor. I'm going to go into single digit precision, and I'm going to search noise floor. You would think if noise floor was such a great thing about 32-bit float, it would be mentioned in the Wikipedia articles or anywhere. But as I said, this is they're talking about this. It means nothing to an engineer. Okay, so capture without distorting. These terms how that include digital clipping. Now this is correct because for this if we use their scale, which again, forget what you're seeing here. To the computer, it sees a 1 here, and it sees 0 here, it sees a 1 here. So what they're saying is, hey, if we had a 2, we could have a dot here, and we wouldn't get that clipping. Absolutely correct. Absolutely correct. However, 16-bit and 24-bit give you way more numbers than you need that you're not going to get clipping. But, maybe you don't believe me on that. Let's keep going. Okay. So again, what they're saying is correct, though. When they say noise floor, they're talking about apples and oranges. Noise floor is not a computer concept. It has nothing to do with computer memory. It's their abstraction, how they want to call the data. And sure, in the real world, we all know what noise floor is, but in the data, it means nothing. Okay. So in other words, recording at higher bit depths not only allows you to record louder sounds without risk of distortion, it also means your recordings will have a lower audible noise floor. Now, I'll accept it, but it's like, it's just like, it's how they're going to get you into this lie. For comparison, let's look at the dynamic range of different bit depths allows. Now, they go into the same thing that sound design does. And again, these are very specific numbers, and these are scales. These are scales we use to measure sound and how we hear it, right? Because we don't hear the difference in voltage on a speaker from 1 to 4 doesn't sound like it's 4 times greater, right? They just need different scales. Okay. Well, there are plenty of recording scenarios that can generate levels above 66 dB. And again, they're using an abstract concept. What they're saying is that there are plenty of recording scenarios that can generate sound above a sound that's very loud to you. This isn't data talk. It would seem that 144 dynamic range allowed by 24-bit recording would be plenty to capture any sound you could possibly encounter. Absolutely true. So this, again, how they catch you in a lie. They keep telling you these things that are true, but are sort of all a little bit off. And then when they say the lie, you've already accepted a bunch of truths and your mind is tired and you're like, okay, so why 32-bit recording? What could possibly be so loud that you need 32-bit float dynamic range? Indeed. The real benefit of 32-bit float recording actually has to do with its lower noise floor. There's no lower noise floor in 32-bit float, 32-bit fixed, 24-bit fixed, 16-bit, 8-bit, any bit, anything. I just showed you. You can search noise floor and bit depths and you'll find nothing. Has nothing to do with it. Nothing whatsoever. And how it can greatly benefit your workflow as a recording engineer. So what they're basically saying here, and this is why I think many people don't want to believe what I'm saying here, is these companies have played you for a sucker because you don't understand how computers work and you've bought into it. And now when somebody says, oh, you just sold a bunch of stuff that doesn't do what they say you can do, you don't want to admit it. I understand it. I hate being wrong. I hate looking like an idiot. But I'm not the one who sold you this equipment saying that the real benefit of 32-bit float recording actually has to do with its lower noise floor. There's no noise floor in any sort of data space. This is an abstract concept. right? So you say, oh, okay, I don't really understand all this, but if you say this, the 32-bit float has a lower noise floor, okay, all right, great. I'm in because I understand. I don't want noise. So if you say that this has a lower noise floor, and so I'll get less clipping or less noise or whatever, then I'm in. So then it just basically, now once it's gotten you, once you've accepted that, then it goes to town on the absolute BS of what it does, right? Because you've already accepted that, right? You're looking at talking about gains and low gains, right? And you've already bought in to the lie that there's a noise floor in data, and there isn't. And then the other thing that TASCAM likes to do, the other lie that they tell, is let me get my little pen going. In 32-bit float recorder, you have two ADCs working in tandem to create a single audio file. One low-gain ADC is optimized for high-level audio, and another high-gain ADC is optimized for low-level audio. Now, I'm not going to go into this, but this is against physics and the noise that all amplification produces. You cannot split anything and maintain fidelity. There's no way. If you have, what this is saying is you can essentially take the amplitudes, remember the numbers coming from your microphone, right? That you can split these up, and this can get a 173, let's just say, and this can get a 173. Have you ever seen any musician doing that? Like they take their guitar and they do a separate lead, they plug it in separately to each, let's just say, pedal? No. It's just physically impossible. The only way you could do it is if you take this 137 and you amplify it into this current, and then you amplify it into this current. Every time you want to break up your audio current, you need to amplify it. And every time you amplify it, you add noise, because that's how electronics work. There's no way to get around. Anybody that says you can amplify something with zero noise it's just incorrect. Now, maybe the amount of noise that doesn't make a difference that you don't hear. So for a guitarist, like, okay, they're putting it through, 20 pedals and it's generating noise, but in an arena or wherever, like, it just doesn't make a difference. I mean, people don't hear it. Actually, people don't really mind noise. Like, you can tolerate a lot of noise. What you cannot tolerate a lot of is distortion. And if you read anyone that's really into audio, this is what everybody is afraid of. And to wrap it up, let me get back to our old thing at Sound Designs. Because all these numbers here are not evenly spaced, this is de facto, whether you think it's too much or too little, distorted. Where are we? 33 minutes. All right. Any questions, put them in the comments. Or you can call these manufacturers yourself and ask them point blank, is our 32-bit float numbers accurate in the same way that 24-bit numbers are accurate? And if you remove all the inaccuracies from 32-bit float numbers, how many numbers are you left with? How many bits of precise numbers are you left with? All right. I hope this at least shows you what they're leaving out, and just another way for you to start to understand 32-bit float if you don't already.